Knock, knock, who's there? Autism.
So what you just witnessed was one of my favorite memes. It is a door with a narrator saying, knock, knock, who's there? Autism. The door opens. There's a dinosaur, generic green dinosaur, and it does a little dance. This episode of the Unwelcome Access podcast is aptly titled Ross's Meme Folder Exposed. This is the autism episode. Autism is what I am most involved with work-wise and also living-wise. I am autistic, obviously. And so this is an episode that I put a lot of energy into, but I also wanted to make it fun. I could go on and on and on about specific autism presentations, specific therapies, specific interventions. Those can all be their own episodes. This is the general overview. I put in as many autism memes as I could physically fit into this PowerPoint presentation. Up on the screen, we have a whale shark, gray and white sort of speckled on the top, and then below it's white, in a bunch of fish under the sea, with a fiery lettered autism to title this presentation. This is the Unwelcome Access podcast, and I'm looking forward to teaching y'all about the bread and butter of my work. So let's start by talking about story time. This is a hard story time to do for me. Not because of some others where it's, oh, I'm really upset, or oh, this is something that's really deeply upsetting to me. And unlike the image on the screen, which is my usual image I use for this, which is me driving a train looking like I'm about to do very unkind things to people, but I'm really having the time of my life, I want to sort of hit on diagnosis. So I was diagnosed in 2001. I was 5. This is early on in how we think about autism. Or rather, not early on, but so I was diagnosed in 2001. This is a time where things are very different in how we think about autism. And really, if it wasn't for where I was, shout out to Special School District of St. Louis County in Missouri, I would not have gotten a diagnosis. 2001 is the era of autistic kids are little white boys having a bad time. Now, I was a little white boy, but I was quote-unquote intelligent. I'm getting a PhD. I don't know how true that is, but But the reason I say this is that diagnosis has changed a lot over time, and only because they were testing everyone for various developmental disabilities, which we'll get into in a moment. But because they were testing everyone for developmental disabilities, it meant that I was able to get the actual diagnosis despite not fitting how most people thought of it. On the other hand, my fiance, who was entering school at the same time, lived in a different part of the country that did not have a separately funded special education system. Most special education has a pittance of federal and state funding, but schools have to find the rest on their own. Obviously, this leads to things not perhaps being the greatest in a lot of systems where it comes to things that are more expensive, like the child find requirement. When I do the special education episode, I'll talk more about this, but school districts are supposed to, at least under the special education law, actively be trying to recognize and support disabled kids. A lot of them don't do this, and the school district my fiance was in is one of them. Her parents, however, thought something might be up, and she already had a diagnosis of neurofibromatosis. Essentially, it is a neurodevelopmental disorder where a lot of tumors form on the nervous system. She has a extremely non, how do I phrase this? A less impactful case, but it's still there. And a lot because it is a neurodevelopmental disability, which I will define that here in probably the next couple slides. But because it is a neurodevelopmental disability, there's a lot of overlap with autism. And I say this because she was brought to her doctor. But it wasn't the neurofibromatosis that was why she didn't get a diagnosis. The doctor, and this is the quote I've gotten, said, well, she's 1, making eye contact, and 2, a girl. She can't be autistic. Now, one of the things with autism is that autistic people recognize each other all the time. It's sort of in the same way that if you're in a particular subculture with music or a fan of a specific sports team or whatever, you might recognize somebody there. Autistic people know how to recognize our own. I bring this up because when we started dating, I noticed immediately. And the moment I am an expert in autism things. So I was able to recognize it both professionally and personally, even if I can't give an official diagnosis. We'll come back to that. But because I can't give an official diagnosis, it means nothing. But when I had pushed her to go and talk to her doctor about getting a referral, her doctor said, oh, you would be diagnosed by now if you were autistic. Which completely ignores the fact that she told the same story I said, where a doctor actively chose not to diagnose her because she's a girl. Autism is a fundamentally and in many ways extremely misunderstood disability. It's a disability that people don't really get because it's been portrayed as this mysterious thing. But the reality is that autism is not really any more complex in reality than anything else. But let's get into an agenda. On the screen, I have a photo of a Chicago L train, stainless steel, sort of flat-sided metro coming into one of the stations in the loop. You have some older brick buildings in the background, and the L train that has a label reading Express coming into the foreground on the right with a crowd of people on the platform on the left. I've added in the laser eye meme, the sort of red with added lens flare effects to it. And this is going to be one of the places where I pay homage to the autistic people like trains thing, which is a statistically validated stereotype. I don't know why they put money into that as research, but they did. So for our agenda today, we're going to define autism first and foremost, which is like saying I'm going to define what is. We're also going to talk about autism misconceptions. That's kind of going to come throughout this, but we're going to really sort of hit on some of the big ones that are pretty definitive. The bulk of this, though, is going to be the Autism History and Neurodiversity Primer, where I sort of talk about how we got to this point, where I'm here giving a podcast on autism and having to talk about, no, vaccines don't cause autism. I'm then going to get into sort of a selected explanation of autism experiences. Traits, symptoms, also known as, but autism is not necessarily a disability in the same way that other disabilities are. And when I say that, it's because for some folks, they don't see different traits as a negative. And we'll get into some of that. I agree that some things that are a result of my autism are not negatives. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't autistic, for example, and you wouldn't be learning from me if I wasn't. That said, I also have a anti-agenda. On the right here, we have a Chicago and Northwestern green and yellow train on a far track with a number of folks in line to get on it. The train has a wreath on the front of it, as this was from a Christmas train. Again, going into the I'm not beating my autistic man likes train allegations, but I'm also not beating the putting trains related to autism allegations. But I do want to talk about sort of the anti-agenda, because there's a lot of things that I could get into, and a lot of things that really will need their own episode. Specific interventions, and I use interventions here in the clinical sense. Anything that is done to try to support someone with a disability. This is mostly what it's known as in special education or sort of more cultural fields, but it's the things that you do to provide that disability support. I'm also not really going to talk about specific locations or life areas. This is not going to be the autism food episode. There's going to be a food episode coming, but this is also not going to be the autism in parks episode, which there will be, because that is one of the areas I am definitely one of the leading experts on the planet in. I'm also not going to talk about specific organizations where I can. There will probably be a whole episode on disability services and disability rights organizations, as well as disability advocacy organizations. I'll probably mention a few here and there, but I'm trying to make this one not as much of the Ross is a hater episodes. That being said, let's talk about what autism is. On the right, I have an image of Garfield the cat with the "Please be patient, I have autism" blue hat on his head. On the top, there is a poorly titled and phrased scientific article. I'll probably do scientific writing as another episode as well. But this article says, "Why advertising falls flat in individuals with autism. What if a certain mindset and quote-unquote disability made you a savvier consumer?" And below Garfield, "You are immune to propaganda," with the autism hat on. This is, again, I am dumping my meme collection of autism memes here, but when we talk about what's agreed upon with autism, that's not really a huge thing, because autism really is thought of as a single spectrum, and we'll come into that in a moment. But it's more of several million disabilities in a trench coat that have been all categorized together. Now, autism is a neurodevelopmental disability, which means that it affects different developmental steps around the brain. In development here is from the sort of medical education standpoint. What certain milestones someone's supposed to reach that impact their ability to engage with the world. So, for example, with myself, I was in occupational therapy when I was young because I had a lot of issues with motor skill developmental stages. And that is because I'm autistic. But usually this interferes and interacts with the socialization components as well as the physical ones of development. But autism is primarily a socially related disability. It really is more the social model of disability than the medical one. Now, if you want more on what the social model and medical model are, the short version is social model is disability is the result of the choices of society versus the medical model, which is disability is stored within the person, and therefore the issues are that person's to deal with. So, for example, you go into Walmart, it's too loud. Medical model is, well, you should wear headphones or go to our little special time for special people that we're putting at a time when there are less people so that we still make money. Social model is, why the hell are you putting your music up that loud in a Walmart? People aren't going to Walmart to listen to music. But when we're talking about neurodevelopmental disabilities, going back to that, they are present from birth. Nobody gets autism. I will make jokes about it all the time. But nobody actually ever is going to get autism from somebody else or from a factor after they are born. One of the big misconceptions is autism usually comes up at the age of 3 for the more significant support needs that people have. Problem is that because it's a neurodevelopmental disability, it more is showing up then because that's when the preponderance of milestones usually come together to where you can make a definitive statement that, yes, this is due to the many conditions we put in a trench coat called autism. However, it does lead to this misconception that it is a childhood disability. It's a lifelong condition. I'm not going to stop being autistic. I never stopped being autistic at 18 or 21, depending on my jurisdiction. I also always have been autistic, as I said, and it impacts a lot of different life conditions and activities. It's also not a line spectrum, but it is a spectrum. Now, when I say life activities, we'll come to this towards the end of this presentation, but I'm talking about the different ways that autism can present can impact specific parts of how you live your life. So, for example, autism impacts eating, but it also impacts motor skills. The reality is, and this is something that is part of the reason that there are a lot of focuses on kids, childhood interventions have been shown to be the most effective at supporting long-term independence, health, decision-making, etc. This is less of a, oh, well, then we should only focus our resources on kids, more of a, turns out when you start doing things when earlier on, you tend to get better results. You tend to get better results when it's day 1, as opposed to waiting till day 30 to start doing whatever task it is. This, however, doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be providing supports for adults, as we'll get into. That said, one of the things that a lot of people get wrong is, as I mentioned, the spectrum. So first, I want to state that saying someone is on the spectrum, not really the best language. We're not going to get into disability language too much in this. Just let people identify how they want and don't force your identifier on them. That is the shortest way I can go about it, and it is the correct way. That said, to sort of visualize it here on the screen, I have 3 chevrons pointing down. The top one has low functioning, the bottom one has moderate functioning, and the middle one has moderate functioning, and the bottom one has high functioning. This is how most people think of it, in no small part due to the fact that the medical model of disability, go back and watch episode 1, which has all of this in there, but the medical model of disability is more concerned on, is this impacting you? How do we deal with the impact that your disability has on your ability to do things, as opposed to addressing more structural concerns. So being able to put people into these very defined categories of how they're quote unquote functioning, it looks very attractive to medical staff. But I have here a image that I put together, which is a sort of pie graph with sort divided into different slices, but also different levels. So there's a center sort of target area, a middle one, and then an outer one. So it's 3 levels on this sort of pie graph. Some of the slices are filled in all the way to 3. Some of them are filled in only to 1. Some of them are filled into 2. This is much closer to what the autism spectrum is like. There are things you are good at and things you are not so good at, like anyone else. It just turns out that with the autism spectrum, the things that someone is less good at usually can have some negative impacts on their life. Just thinking of someone as being high functioning, low functioning, whatever, also reduces their humanity. Thinking of somebody as, okay, this is what they actually need help in, that does a lot more to actually solve what they're facing. So for example, I have various sensory input related issues. I can get overstimulated, and we'll get into what that actually means here in a moment. But what essentially is going on is, oh, I get put into certain environments for too long, I start to have issues. I don't have issues with communicating or putting together this PowerPoint presentation or finding a fiance or anything like that. The reality is that a lot of the time, and there have been times I've had this happen to me, someone will mention, I am autistic, and they're treated as if they will not be able to comprehend what is being told to them. Doesn't matter if they have a master's or even a PhD. There are a lot of people who do not understand that autism is not you are either going to be Albert Einstein or you're going to be someone who is not going to ever function in society. But functioning labels are more of another example of something that is useful for specific clinicians, making its way out into the public, especially around autism. And that's honestly where one of the where a lot of the misconceptions come in. So let's talk about what autism isn't. So on the right, I have an image I made. You have a steam locomotive, nickel plate 765, a very large locomotive with a lush green treetops behind it. And in the foreground, there is a anime girl of some sort. I don't know who this is. I do not consume the anime. Wearing that same blue Please Be Patient, I Have Autism hat, holding the autism creature, which is a 4-legged creature of some sort with dark eyes and a neutral expression and a chicken tender. Now, again, I put this on the what isn't autism slide, despite it having many stereotypes. Mostly because this is it's a good example of the fact that a lot of stereotypes come out of context. So the first one, autism is not caused by vaccines. Vaccines are safe. Go get your flu shot. Go get your COVID shot. If you are saying that vaccines cause autism, or even saying vaccines are dangerous, you're responding to a hack, and I mean a hack. And you're also ableist, because saying, well, I'd rather my kid not have a vaccine so they don't get autistic, that's just saying I'd rather have my kid dead than be autistic. And honestly, if that's what you're saying, you really are not caring about your child. Now, the other one, autism is not only for little white boys having a bad time. Girls can be autistic, boys can be autistic, non-binary folks can be autistic. People who do not believe in their gender can be autistic. It doesn't matter. It is a neurodevelopmental disability. It can be something that everyone can have. Also, as we'll see, a lot of the attention gets focused on the folks who are having a bad time, not for the reasons of this is where we need the resources most. But because it has been, you have this stereotype. I highly recommend, there's an article called The Cloak of Incompetence. I will have the link to that in the description of this video, as well as linked to on Patreon, and whenever I put this on my website, there will be a link there. But one of the main reasons that this perpetuates itself is that media tends to portray the easiest thing to portray, and it's really hard to portray an autistic person who is just a person who happens to be autistic and have that be a visualizable thing. So you often end up with, well, it has to be somebody who's having a meltdown that, is going to look good on camera. The other thing is, autism is very much tied to intellectual disability in the popular sense, but it isn't required at all. In fact, autism hasn't needed intellectual disability as a requirement to diagnose it. I don't believe in any of the diagnostic statistical manuals or DSMs that have been put out that have actually had autism as a disability. That's what the word is. That being said, it's also not just a sensory disability. It affects all parts of the brain. Again, it's easier to point at, okay, they can't deal with the loud that's over there. Let's put some headphones on them, than to address that, hey, this store doesn't need to be this loud. Let's turn it down. Especially when the radio or music company that they're working with is saying, for best effect, put it at too loud. Not because that too loud is any better for people to hear, but because that too loud makes sure that people do hear the music. But sensory things are a part of it. They're just not the only part of it. It's also not a curse, bad, or ruiner of lives. When we talk about service organizations and advocacy organizations later on, I will get into this more, but one of the ways that people have tried to raise money on the topic has always been portraying it as something that's negatively impacting people. And not that it doesn't, but the way that it is usually shown is that if you have autism, it's going to negatively impact your life no matter what. You will have a bad, horrible life that is not worth living if you're autistic, so we need to figure out a way to stop people from being autistic. This is very much not the case. We're talking you would have to remove a large part of who people are to make someone not autistic. It's also not savantism, or savantism, rather. Things like Rain Man are the best example of this. Autistic savants are a thing. They are not what most people experience, and it's actually incredibly rare. Savantism is essentially someone who might have high support needs in almost everything, so they couldn't live alone or couldn't handle their own money or something like that. But they have a niche area where, say, like painting, they're just perfect at it, or they have perfect musical ability. Those make really good feel-good stories. Problem is that as feel-good stories, they end up being what you hear about autistic people getting success. The reality is most people are closer to me than they are to most of the stereotypes that you will see. It's just that those stereotypes make better TV and thus are reinforced, or the money gets put into those areas. That being said, I want to get into a bit of a retrospective view. So, on the screen, I'm at the Illinois Railway Museum taking this picture. There is a steam locomotive, Frisco 1630, with the black boiler and tender and water tanker, with black smoke coming out of the smokestack and white steam coming out of the various steam vents. And it is in reverse, which is why I said retrospective. Now, this is also the image that became my logo. But, that being said, yes, I'm biased. That said, I want to get into a bit of history stuff. And so I have a screenshotted Twitter post that was then taken from iFunny. For my historical diagnosis rant. The user, Dropout Ninja, posted, "There weren't as many autistic folks back in the day. Oh sure, your grandfather who info-dumped about postage stamps and ate the exact same lunch every day was the epitome of normal." This came back from 2023. But this is something that people have said for a while. Historical diagnosis and I do not get along. In part because when I was diagnosed, it was with Asperger's syndrome. And I'm going to be talking about that here. But Asperger's syndrome is an outdated diagnosis, but it was also one that sort of came around this idea of there are autistic people who are better than all the other autistic people and therefore should get more resources or not be looked down on or whatever. It's also one that has been applied retroactively to various people who are now dead. Mozart, Einstein, so on and so forth. Autism has always been a thing. I'm pulling out my bachelor's degree in history, blowing off the dust, and we're dealing with a lot of social constructs here that make doing history on this an extremely niche and extremely specific vein of historian that has to train for a long time to do it. So, disability, we've already talked about social and medical models. It's a social construct in a lot of cases. Now, it's a social construct based off of physical attributes or mental attributes, but it's still a construct. History is also a social construct, but it's what I would call a dual social construct. Namely, how you interpret history is done based on your present circumstances. So what's going on in the world around you? A lot of people have been comparing current American politics to 1933 Germany. The reality is that history is also constructed socially at its own time. So I'm published as a historian, undergrad history journal, so not anything super fancy. But what I published on was specifically the British ending the slave trade. One of the things I found there, looking at the sources from the time period, do not read all of British parliamentary record. It will do wild things to your brain. But is that a lot of what people were saying at the time was very genuine. There were genuine beliefs at the time that the path that they were going on, that going and bombarding Algiers for doing slave trade things was entirely moral. When, as a current historian, you look back and even if they believed it was also a way to exert British power. Even if people arguing for it were doing it out of their own morals. In this way, history is not just something you can interpret solely from your own lens, but you have to look at the lens that whatever your sources are written in. So it makes applying modern conceptions to the past very difficult. Sure, for something like this meme, your grandfather who info-dumped on postage stamps and ate the same staple lunch. Yeah, using that as a comeback for the ableism mom who refuses to acknowledge that autism is just more understood and has to think that it is an epidemic, that is fine. The problem is that when you push for, oh, some famous figure had autism, that becomes an issue where you are not necessarily able to make that assertion because autism is so tied into the social conditions someone lives in, and diagnosis as a neurodevelopmental disability has to have, in almost every case, a major element of that childhood experience involved. This isn't to say that people were not autistic in the past. It's just that applying our modern conception of it, especially when you think of it as a disability, especially when applied to people who were very successful, you can't necessarily do that and have it be as clean as people want to make it out to be. And it can also lead to people not necessarily developing a sense of the self and of their disabled self and autistic self based on their circumstances. Again, using myself as an example, Einstein had the pop culture theory of Einstein's autistic, Einstein had Asperger's. My parents very much pushed that because in 2001, you had known eugenicist Temple Grandin. Page 124, Thinking in Pictures Extended Edition, Temple Grandin says to cull autistic people who have higher support needs. But that's the kind of role model you have to give a kid. And my parents were trying to find a good role model. When I found out in 2011 that Asperger's is not just this fancy thing I had like Einstein, but it's autism, that kind of broke me for high school because autism was still very much a schoolyard slur. There is a time and place for this kind of thing, but making it the center of looking at history and saying, oh, this person, that person is autistic, doesn't always line up. But it's still also good to know how we got to our current point when talking about autism. And we're going to move on to the next slide. I have a meme of Lisa Simpson, mouth ajar, eyes wide, staring down, with the text, when something makes you so angry, you're left completely emotionally dysregulated for the rest of the day. I include this meme because this first page of the autism timeline is the early days, and emotional dysregulation was one of the big ways that autism was first looked at. 1911, Eugen Bleuler, I probably didn't pronounce that correctly, first used the word autism as a way to describe schizophrenia. Now you might be thinking, wait, why was it used to describe schizophrenia? As it turns out, schizophrenia had a much broader definition in the past, and autism, particularly in the sense of being in the sort of internalizing aspects of autism, that was how it was being described at first. However, in 1925, this is when things really start for looking at autism. Post-production, Ross, put in the music. So what you just heard was the Soviet anthem, or at least the first chord of it. The first work on what we consider today to be autism was done in 1925 by Grunya Efimovna, Shukareva. I, again, apologize to all speakers of Russian and of all languages. My mouth does not make words the best, even in English, and I've been speaking that my whole life. Shukareva was really the first person to write about autism. The problem is that Shukareva was in the USSR, and first the Stalinist purges come in the 30s, and a lot of that is aimed at academics. Then you have the whole Cold War thing, and a lot of Soviet research wasn't getting out. There's also the fact that during the Cold War, and in particular, mostly because of World War II being really in Europe a Russian war in terms of where a lot of the damage was done, disability up until really today in a lot of the former Soviet countries and Soviet client states is, did you lose a leg fighting the Nazis? If yes, you get state support. If no, really nothing for you. There's a very physical and attained model of disability that was prevalent in the USSR in the post-World War era through to today. That is a whole other conversation, but that meant that a lot of this research wasn't really being prioritized and also wasn't being shared with most of the rest of the world. However, in 1938, the Nazi scientist Hans Asperger first coined the phrase in its modern conception. Hans Asperger is a Nazi. He was a psychiatrist who basically came up with sort of defining what we would call Asperger syndrome as a form of autism as a way to keep kids from being genocided by the Nazis. And when we talk about Nazi genocide, it's usually focused on the Holocaust. I'm half Jewish on my dad's side. I don't practice. And Jews were very much the most notable target in terms of what the rhetoric was talking about. Disabled people were also very much targeted, and in fact were one of the first groups to be actively genocided. That said, Hans Asperger really creates this as this way to say this group is still useful, do not kill them. And this sort of has this autistic exceptionalism tied with his line of specifically looking at folks with lower support needs. And that continues up through today. That said, 1944 in the US, Leo Kanner, probably, first uses the term autism to describe classical autism. This is your high support needs in almost all categories, little white boy having a bad time rocking in the corner. Notably, Asperger and Connor both were describing mostly boys. Not necessarily because they didn't have access to girls, but because that was who they were looking at. And this has, from the 30s and 40s, continued to a lot of today with how we think of autism. But Connor sort of setting the stage for classical autism in the 40s really is still tying it into, at first, schizophrenia. It's this broad idea of all the ways that the brain might not present in a typical way were seen as that broader diagnosis. Slowly over time, from that sort of particularly 1938 original look, we really start to see it as a diagnosis later on. But 1949, I do want to hit on this before we move on to the next slide. It's the first time we really hit refrigerator mother theory. Now, a refrigerator mother is from Connor's ideas of autism is tied to that emotional dysregulation. And it comes from this idea that emotional dysregulation is because you didn't get hugged enough by your mom. It is as silly as it sounds. And I can assure you that I did not have a lack of affection from my parents. But this becomes the sort of original way that people start thinking about it. And this leads to a lot of the way that parents groups have formed as support groups for people who know, but also focusing on, well, let's not blame the parents, let's find something else to blame, which has led to a bunch of other things. We'll come back to that. But again, this is the really early stuff. Post-war era, 1952 is when we have the first DSM, as I said, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. I also have on the right here another meme. It is a cat standing on 2 feet, looking down, looking sad, sorry for acting autistic on top. It will happen again. We'll see why I have it here, but we have a lot of startings to look at autism as a diagnostic sort of something that has a definitive diagnostic criteria at this point. And autism, as we know it now, is at this time called childhood schizophrenia. So, 1961 in the UK. Along this time, we have the UK has the National Health Service, and they hire a psychiatrist, Mildred Creek, to look at the first sort of behavioral ways to look at autism. Now, this comes up with a total of 9 points. First, gross and sustained impairment of emotional relationships with people. You also have apparent unawareness of his own personal identity to a degree inappropriate to his age. This is where you have the little white boy hitting their head on the wall in the corner coming from. Notably, these are his. Creek did not look at all at women or young girls at all. Pathological preoccupation with particular objects or certain characteristics of them, without regard to their accepted functions. This is stimming, but it's also gets into what we now call hyperfixation, which I will define more later on, and special interests. Sustained resistance to change in the environment, and a desire for sameness. That's point 4. Abnormal perceptual experience. So, for example, this is all the overstimulation stuff I've talked about. Number 6. Acute, excessive, and seemingly illogical anxiety. Autism and anxiety are the best of friends. Basically, if you have, this is looking at, does change bother you? Speech issues, whether it's me as I am right now, where I'm having to sort of pause to catch my brain back up to my mouth or my mouth back up to my brain. But it's also things like echolocalia, which is I am copying somebody. It's also known as parroting. You also have distortion in motility patterns, which are posturing, I call shrimping, sitting weird in a chair, or flapping, which is a type of stimming, where you flap your arms, as well as sort of ritualistic ways of engaging. And then this is where you first have the connection where you have to have intellectual disability. At the end of the day, this is one of the big reasons that autism is so tied to intellectual disability, despite the fact that there is nothing that really requires you to have an intellectual disability to have autism. This definition, however, forms the basis of all other autism definitions. All of them have evolved from this one, and you can see that a lot if you were to actually look at the current DSM definition, which I'm not going to do in this episode. 1965. Ivar Lovaas, damned be his name, and various other folks start getting involved in things like Time Magazine and going on TV. And this is the point where we really start to see the entrenchment of autism as it's thought of in its classical form as the way you have autism. Ivar Lovaas is also involved with 1968's Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis. He's the guy behind Applied Behavioral Analysis, first and foremost, and while I'm doing a full episode on it with interventions later, ABA is Pavlov for kids. I don't mean it in the sense of things like looking at behavior and addressing behavior with positive supports or whatever. Lovaas straight up did torture to kids, and a lot of ABA still is torture. I do not have a very fond view of it, in part because ABA is one of those applied behavior analysis. That'd be great. Most of the time, we are punishing you for acting autistic. Whether it's explicitly a punishment or we are forcing you to go through this whole rigmarole just because you won't make eye contact like I think you should. That said, we're going to skip a little ahead and come out of order on this next one. Hans Asperger was still working during this time period, but because he was a Nazi, he really wasn't getting a lot of his works were not making it into the broader sphere. But a psychiatrist or psychologist named Lorna Wing popularized the work, especially around kids with low support needs, and coined Asperger's syndrome. Now, the other part of Asperger that I want to mention before we really move on from him, he was the head of a specific psychiatric facility where a lot of people, particularly Jewish scientists, fled to the US and started working under Connor. So even if he wasn't specifically involved with a lot of the work himself, a lot of the folks who he had worked with and who had been influenced by him were. But I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our sponsors for this episode. Hit it, pre-recorded Ross. Wow, Future Ross, what a great ad. Or maybe there isn't one. As always, our primary sponsor is you, the viewer, over on patreon.com/unwelcomeaccess. However, this space is intentionally left open for disabled people who have a project, a business, something they want to get out there to help platform people who might not otherwise get a chance to share in this sort of format. That said, back to your regular programming. I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Thank you, Ross of the past. So, now we're going to get back into the rest of the timeline. I still have a lot to go here. We still have about 10 more slides. But a lot of this is still really important to know just because it sort of shows why I'm talking about some of the things I am. So, 1983. Mike Oliver first gets into the social model of disability. This isn't me being just Ross and saying, this is a thing that is definitely true. Trust me, bro. It is a theory that's existed for a long time. And the social model being the dominant model of disability, in terms of as most people think about it in spaces that actively work with disabled people, has taken 40, almost 50 years to happen. That said, sort of to that point of a lot of disabled people having to push these theories ourselves. On the right, we have a young woman who is looking down towards an older woman sitting on a couch who is looking up to her, not exactly amused by whatever the woman on the left, the younger woman on the left, is saying. The meme says, for the woman on the left, me explaining to my mom that I'm autistic. On the right, my mom with autistic tendencies who thinks everything I feel is normal. A lot of folks who do not necessarily know what they don't know usually end up being resistant to the idea that they could be outside of the norm, which is part of a lot of what we run into, especially with the social model. 1994 or 1984, we have the first U.S. Autism Awareness Month. This is a congressionally mandated thing. It's just slapping a coat of paint on the month and saying it's Autism Month. That said, 1985, we have the first use of the Picture Exchange Communication System, or PEC system. If you want more on that, go back to my episode on assistive technology. I talk a little bit about it there. That said, the 80s are really when a lot of the systems that we see today that are more socially focused start to coalesce. But 1987 rather, you have the DSM-3R. Now, the DSM-2 wasn't really a big change on how what we call autism now is defined, and neither was 3. But 3R, 3 revised, had autism as its own disability type under autistic disorder. 1989, the social narrative, under the Social Stories brand name, which had already been in use. This was a thing that had existed for a while. It was just coalesced and sort of formalized, was first used. And a social narrative is something I've put together before. I'll probably put a link to a good one here in the description below, but it's essentially a narrative beginning to end version of a social experience, whether it's a classroom activity or visiting a museum. 1992 and the 90s are a weird time with autism things. The 80s, you see some, hopeful things where you're starting to look at, especially with interventions, more how do we actually support people. The 90s, you start to look at some of the autism grift coming about, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But Temple Grandin, who is an autistic woman, used a squeeze machine that she had developed based on, hey, I like deep pressure. Let's use this on cows. She is a cattle scientist, first and foremost. But she started using these cattle devices on humans. Turns out autistic people like that deep pressure. Weighted blankets are a thing for a reason. This, however, sort of put her in this space of autistic person who is now studying autism, even if it was sort of a side gig. Her big thing is cattle, and then she wrote books and made stupid amounts of money off them, while still saying that autistic people who have higher support needs should be called 124, Thinking in Pictures, extended edition. But this is sort of the start of looking at how do we profit off of it. That said, let's get to some of the more positive parts of the 90s. 1994, we have the DSM-4. This is good and bad, as it sort of recognizes that autism is very much a thing, it's here to stay, and that there are different ways that you can exist autistically. But the DSM-4 makes one of the biggest mistakes in psychiatry, in my opinion, which is let's take the autism disabilities and turn them into 3 different things. So DSM-4 puts together pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, also known as PDD-NOS, Asperger's syndrome, which, as I mentioned earlier, sort of gets popularized in the early 90s with this idea of Asperger's work being something to look at on this, especially around lower support needs. And then autistic disorder, classical autism. Asperger's syndrome, again, creates this autistic exceptionalism that is not actually all that great. Because it, again, separates people from others who have similar experiences just to have areas where they have higher support needs. At the end of the day, autistic people are autistic people no matter what your support needs are. And it was unfortunately a great way to divide people. And to this day, a lot of folks with Asperger's, or who were diagnosed with Asperger's rather, cling to that definition, not because it is any meaningfully different than the current definition, but because to them it is what they need to stick to. 1998, though. 1998, Judy Singer coins the idea of neurodiversity. This is kind of the neurodiversity primer as well for this podcast, because we're going to have the neurodiversity onion. That was cheesy, but I did it. That said, on the screen I have a target diagram. The center purple is a specific disability. A yellow gold ring around that is neurodivergence. And the outermost ring in white, or sort of an off-white blue, is neurodiversity. People usually think of neurodiversity as what neurodivergence is. But the idea behind neurodiversity is that all brain types are equally valid. Some might need more support than others, but the same goes for literally anything. Neurodivergence is the idea of we are supporting people generally who have these brain differences. Someone who deviates from, or not deviates, but somebody who is different than the norm. At the end of the day, a neurodivergent person is still a part of neurodiversity, just like a neurotypical or somebody who isn't neurodivergent person is still a part of neurodiversity. While this episode is mostly autism, I bring it up here because Singer is autistic, and because an autistic person first coined it to say, hey, let's not have autism be, a dirty word and treat people whose brains operate differently like people, it's really been adopted first and foremost by autistic people. This is interesting considering that if you were to look at it by the numbers of diagnoses, not including undiagnosed folks, we're going to come back to that at some point. I kind of hit it in the story time with my fiance. There's a lot of folks who aren't diagnosed with various neurodivergent disabilities for various social reasons. The idea, though, if you were to look at just what's been diagnosed, you'd see a vast majority of people who are talking about neurodiversity, if it was represented proportionally, would be dyslexic. That is by far the largest group that is a neurodivergent disability within that neurodivergent area. Is the largest sort of specific disability, rather. But it has been pushed hardest by autistic people, who in a lot of ways, because it's our idea, but because it's really beneficial to this idea that not all parts of autism are disabling. We'll come back to that in the last section. But I want to get back to the timeline. So I'm now going to talk about what we have on the right. So the puzzle piece logo comes out of the UK in the 50s, 60s, because autism is a puzzling condition. The British have done, between the various folks involved in the UK with autism, y'all have done a lot of bad stuff. Why can't I remember her name? The woman who made those 5 points that basically said you have to be somebody with an intellectual disability to be autistic, that we're all looking at it as a deficit. The puzzle piece logo, and our next contender. But the puzzle piece logo has been widely adopted, even though neurodivergent people, autistic people in particular, have really leaned into an infinity symbol. Looking at we're a part of all of it. Whereas the autism awareness type folks have really leaned into the puzzle piece because listening to autistic people is puzzling to them because they don't want to try. And this is a perfect example of it. It's a Punisher skull, so a skull with no bottom jaw, with 4 long teeth, with a red, yellow, and blue puzzle piece background, other than the eyes, which are black, and a autism awareness ribbon put into it. This is kind of the timeline, part where the timeline goes from some of those more hopeful things to the autism grift and things like this particular, I think it's a magnet. I don't know what this product actually is. But things like this are part of the autism grift. I need to show myself as being supportive. And that really hits. Hardest in also 1998. Andrew motherfucking Wakefield ruins everything. This is the guy who published a fraudulent study saying vaccines cause autism. It is one of the very few studies that The Lancet, the premier medical journal for the world, has ever retracted. Think about that for a moment. Wakefield is a former British scientist. I say former because he's not a scientist anymore and lost his medical license over this. But he patented a vaccine of his own. And was like, wait a moment, I need to find a reason to not have the current MMR vaccine, which, again, was perfectly safe and is perfectly safe, from competing too much with me. And so he faked a study, as in completely lied about half of the data he put in. Like, if you actually looked at it, and any of the peer reviewers had actually read the study, they would have recognized this is a lie. This is all lies. Wakefield then went on a media blitz to try to discredit the current MMR vaccine and push his own. Not because of anything wrong with the MMR vaccine. It's a very sound and tested technology. But because he made up the lie about a preservative being linked to autism. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about around 3, which is when you get a lot of these vaccines, when these various traits of autism start to show. He found a weakness, and especially when you look at up until really just before this point, refrigerator mother theory was the predominant and still was a very dominant theory publicly. And what a lot of parents were being pushed at, or being pushed as the reason that their kid was autistic, was their own fault. So Andrew Wakefield finds a little crack and pushes it. And the various autism parent groups that were trying to legitimately deal with a situation where there weren't a lot of resources. And there wasn't a lot of knowledge on what autism is, how do you support autistic people, especially if you're a parent. These groups clung on to this because it gave them something that wasn't their fault, but a big shadowy actor, a big bad guy. This set back things decades. This is why the COVID bullshit around vaccines happened. Because one guy wanted to make it big off of his vaccine, which could have perfectly well been put out there. But Wakefield was greedy and created one of the most ableist movements of all time that has put so much harm into so many people. But it also set the stage for a lot of the autism grift. I will show you to be supportive even if you aren't actually supportive, so you feel better about yourself. Autism Speaks also really started pushing that. They were founded by wealthy business folks who had an autistic grandchild and have pushed a lot of really negative ideas of what autism is. The next year, the Autism Self-Advocacy Network was founded, which is sort of the antithesis to it. Autism Speaks, I don't believe, currently has any autistic people on their board and does not regularly utilize autistic people in guiding the work they do. Autism Self-Advocacy Network does that because it is all autistic people. 5 years later, a couple of these here are my own theories as a researcher and activist here. 2011 is really the start of the neurodiversity revolution. Sure, it first gets talked about in 98, but 2011 is when you really start to see the perception of autism societally start to shift. Now, there's still a lot of people who have a lot of these same negative, you can't be a girl and autistic ideas. But this is when the momentum really starts rolling, when you really start looking at, okay, what about the rest of the world and not just the classroom? Now, 2013, the DSM-5 puts all the autisms into autism spectrum disorder, and this was a good thing. It should have always been this. And as a historian, I'm not going to look too much at more recent things, because I can't, as a historian, comment too much about how they've affected things. 2013 is honestly even pushing it. But I am putting in that 2025 is the foundation of Autism LLC. Please give me work. I would like to help you not do ableism. shilling on my own podcast aside, we're getting into the last section. We're going to talk about some autism experiences, a brief overview of some common traits. And by common traits, I mean a lot of people experience these. Not everyone experiences these, and not everyone experiences them the same way. You've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and one autistic person is one autistic person. If you are going to be a, if you're going to generalize anything, it's that listening to the actual people there is the best way to go about it. But this is intended to give folks just general knowledge on how do I at least know what somebody's talking about when they're talking about X, Y, or Z. The image here on the screen is a skeleton with a large sword from Das Share Zone, which has a title, Shut the Fuck Up, Neurotypical, misspelling neurotypical. I'm not done talking about fish. This is a play on some of the very cringy memes where somebody is meant to look super badass. And it's talking about info dumping, which I'll talk about when we get to social presentations of autism, social experiences. There's a lot of good memes in this section. First one is the Autism Sampler Platter. The first one is the Autism Sampler Platter. We have user Hey Billy Ray, who has written, "Babe, what's wrong? You've barely touched your Autism Sampler Platter." And it's got dino nuggets, curly fries, mozzarella sticks, potato puffs in different letter shapes, waffles, smiley potatoes, pizza, and SpaghettiOs. These are all some of the various foods that people associate with autistic people because they're safe foods. But I first want to talk about over and under stimulation. So one of the big things that comes about is overstimulation. Think of the brain like a bathtub. As you experience the world around you, water fills up your tub. That water is everything you're experiencing, all the things you're sensing. Touch, sight, smell, information, whatever. Neurotypical brain, that tub can handle it just fine unless you're doing something that you're not supposed to do with the tub. If you're a neurodivergent person, particularly autism, also ADHD, but autism here, that tub is very shallow and doesn't hold as much water. Or the drain is one of those stirring straws that doesn't really drain all that well. Or your faucet's a fire hose. When you have the tub overflow, you have a meltdown. As I said, you can still overflow a neurotypical bathtub brain analogy. You can still get overstimulated if you're neurotypical. It's just a lot harder to do it if you have all of the designs to deal with what's being thrown at you. Autistic brain is not wrong. You can still take a bath in that tub. But you're going to have to be more worried about dealing with what's going in there. Understimulation is kind of the same thing. Same tub analogy, but you can't take a bath without water in there. And so you have to go and find water and bring it up to the tub. These both can lead to their own issues. Understimulation tends to encourage sensory-seeking behaviors. So grabbing things, flapping, running around in a space where you might not be safe to run around. Overstimulation may lead to ways to stimming to try to deal with that. Stimming being essentially ways that you add or remove stimulation or self-regulate. A neurotypical brain kind of can do that on its own. A autistic and other neurodivergent types of brains can't and need to sort of externalize that. Strimping is another sensory thing, sort of within this. Putting yourself in weird kinesthetic body positions. So right now I am sitting semi-cross-legged, pulling my leg in towards me in a weird shrimp-like position. It's basically you're going out and trying to put your body in a place that is kinesthetically able to deal with the stimulation. This is also where a lot of touch issues. There's the idea that autistic people don't like to be touched. Usually it's not quite that extreme. It's just knowing that it's about to happen so you can prepare, but also not having it done during a particularly difficult time, i.e., you're overstimulated. And then there's food. Food can come in a lot of different ways. Taste processing is one, but also a lot of textures. And the energy needed to consume food that you don't know can often be difficult. When I am overstimulated and want to eat, or even just having a bad day and want to eat, I want something where I don't have to think about what is the texture going to be, what is going in my mouth, is this something that I might not like, whatever. I'm going to go to a safe food. A lot of these foods are like what's on the screen. They might be childish, they might be fried, but there's something that you know no matter what you get, you're going to get the same thing every time. This is, again, just a very brief overview. Any of these I could go into way more detail on. But let's move on to physical presentations, and I only have two here, dyspraxia and dysgraphia. And the meme for this one is a woman saying, I am autistic, a man on the left saying, but you don't look autistic, the woman holding up her hand to get an Oscar from an off-screen thing, and in the last part, she's bowing with a spotlight put on her. Thank you, thank you. Autism doesn't have a look. Nobody looks autistic. The thing is that autism is a disability of the brain. It can have physical outcomes, but it is not a physical disability in the same sense of, say, you don't have fingers. There's no way to see autism in somebody. But the two big physical ones I want to talk about are dyspraxia and dysgraphia. They're kind of the same thing in a sense, in that they have a lot of the same sort of root causes, or at least the theories are there. But dyspraxia is basically a lack of gross motor skills, more or less. Your brain and your limbs don't talk all that well, and so you don't know where they are. You might run into stuff a lot. You might be unable to ride a bike. You might be the kid who gets left out during sports games because you can't run super well because you have to put more energy into thinking about how you're running. You're running manually, just like all of you listeners are now breathing manually. Sorry, I had to. But you're picked last. Dysgraphia. That's the specific learning disability for handwriting. And we'll have an episode on specific learning disabilities, but dysgraphia is essentially the same thing, but with the fine motor skill of handwriting. It can also present in other things, like difficulty with other fine motor skills. But again, these are nervous system physical impacts of the disability. Our next meme and area, though, is information processing. So on the screen from at Solarist, I do not know how to pronounce that. But it says people with autism, ADHD and autism be like, damn, I have no motivation to work on this project. Proceeds to recreate all of New York inside Minecraft in 1 hour. And the meme is Josh from Drake and Josh saying, I do not control the hyperfixation. Information processing with the disability is all sorts of things, but The one that is most common, and despite my saying it is not necessary, there is a lot of people who do have it, who do have intellectual disabilities who are autistic. It is not required, but it is common. And intellectual disability will be its own episode, but it's more about processing information, not whether you can retain it with the right supports or not, but it's entirely, can I process this in the moment in a lot of cases. That said, autism often has it as a co-occurring disability. The other one is the half-sibling of autism, ADHD, and focus. Now, the Venn diagram of autism and ADHD are pretty much circles with some differences, but autism in general has a lot of focus issues. There's something called executive function, which my executives don't function right now, and that's not a play on the US government. But executive function is all about, am I able to put myself to a task? So, for example, it's, am I able to, say, sit down and go and record the podcast that I'm recording, or write out this paper until the last moment? Can I motivate myself on my own? Can I recall the information I need to do it? Whatever. Executive function could be a whole episode itself, as ADHD will be. But autism has hyperfixations, which is sort of the opposite. Putting all of your executive function eggs in one basket. Recreating New York inside Minecraft in an hour. Recreating in a silly little boat game a US battleship down to the exact location of every bit of it, and being upset when you couldn't do it. Hyperfixation is that I cannot get my brain to process correctly what I need to be doing right now. I have to do this thing that I have to do right now. And then some more specific learning disabilities, dyslexia and dyscalculia. Dyslexia is the reading learning disability. Dyscalculia is the math learning disability. I'm not getting any more into those because those are big topics of their own and probably will be a huge part of the eventual specific learning disability episode. But they are really, there's a lot of overlap between different types of neurodivergence. If you have one type, you're more likely to have another. There's a reason that I started with autism is several million disabilities in a trench coat. But the last sort of information processing is internal communication. This can often be sort of speech disabilities, or, as you have probably heard in my talking, pausing to get my mouth to catch up to my brain or to correct myself. It's also me having to repeat things at times where I need to make it so that I am actually communicating what I'm intending to communicate. All sorts of ways that your body and your various extremities are communicating with each other can be impacted. Now, in some ways, these are not horrible. When I hyperfixate on paper or putting together a presentation or whatever, lickety split. It can be really beneficial. It doesn't mean that that even something that is sometimes good can't also sometimes be bad. Let's get into the last sort of area of experiences I want to cover, social. And for this, I have two different means. First is a sticker or magnet that says autistic and ready to fuck. And the one below it is a pyramid. It's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs with everything sort of covered up in purple with written down, absolutely feral autistic romance, meaning two autistic people together, where neither of us has any concern of romantic social norms, and we are both each other's special interest, resulting in a raw and primeval kind of love based on mutual obsession. This is just me and my fiance, and I mean, she's the one who sent this. but relationships are often thought to be impossible for autistic people. I will be doing a Unwelcome Access After Dark episode that is going to be very not safe for work in the future. And that's why I'm starting with these memes, because relationships are a big area of disability that people do not like to think about, but y'all should be. That being said, there is something called the double empathy problem. Usually people are said when they are autistic to be unable to form a relationship or unable to understand others. This is not true. In fact, a lot of autistic people report having over empathy and burning themselves out. The double empathy problem basically says, it's basically the social model of disability saying, well, autistic people may not display empathy in the way you are, but you're also not displaying empathy towards us by your own standards. There is a double standard here, where autistic people are often treated as creepy or weird for simple things like not making eye contact, which is a very Western thing, the eye contact thing, but it's also very much a normative thing. There's nothing wrong with not making eye contact. It's entirely a social rule. And a lot of the relationship and social issues are, you don't pick up on the hidden rules. You don't pick up on it's weird to like trains at whatever, or it's weird to still want to wear your coat all day, or it's weird to have a comfort item with you at 13. You don't pick up on these because the thing brings you comfort and helps you maintain the world around you. It provides a totem or whatever. Or it's something that just doesn't make sense. Like, a lot of social rules don't make sense, whether you're neurotypical or not. The fact that these don't make sense often means that people who are autistic are going to ignore it. Because why would I follow something that doesn't make sense? The other part is people tend to have a strong sense of justice who are autistic. It's not necessarily that this moral code is a universal one, because there is no such thing as a universal moral code, right? But whatever they have defined their moral code is, they're sticking to it. Hell or high water. The other part is special interests, which I've hit on before, but a special interest is essentially that thing that you can go back to over and over and over again and talk about forever and ever and ever and info dump on, which info dumping is what it sounds like. It's, I'm just giving you all the information on thing. See, me giving this podcast for almost 2 hours now. That said, special interests are varied. There are a few that are common. Trains are actually statistically validated as a special interest, in the sense that autistic people are more likely to like trains. There's any number of reasons why that could be. That's a whole other episode. That might be a bonus episode if I start making those. But special interests usually are something that someone can cling to and provides a good in their life, even when other things are shit. And even when they're being affected by the beliefs of others. There's also the lack of filter. Now, I have been a bit of a potty mouth in this, and I've been very forward on a lot of what I'm saying. That isn't the lack of filter I'm talking about. I'm just being more direct with a lot of this because that's the point of the podcast, right? The filter is you're in the moment and you make a bad joke because you weren't able to have your mouth and brain communicate that even though you know, hey, I shouldn't, say sadly the Borat my wife line and do a bad impression of that when talking about somebody whose wife died. your brain has moved faster than the check can. This sort of should I be saying this right now? Or that filter doesn't come up automatically. You have to think about it. This is very common and often means people seem rude when in a lot of cases they realize that that was wrong to say. It's just that by the time they've said it, it's too late. The other is employment. I'm doing a whole employment episode next, but autistic people are the most unemployed and underemployed population in the country. And it's because workplace social rules you don't really get taught, even if you have, like me, 12 years of social skills classes through good special education. Sure, you get some stuff transitioning into the workplace, but every workplace has its own social rules. Plus, it's a self-reinforcing thing. Autistic people don't have jobs, so employers see an autistic person and don't think they can do the work, either directly or indirectly, and because interviews and whatnot, and the energy needed to put in a billion applications takes a lot out of somebody. And especially when you're trying to have to figure out what this specific person or AI system wants to read, that's going to be difficult and forces you to spend a lot of energy that you might not have and might not be as easy for you to do as somebody whose brain is neurotypical. Again, a lot of these things are not necessarily that other people don't struggle with it, just that the struggle is more draining because an autistic brain is not wired to do it in the same way a neurotypical brain is. But I've been in this presentation for, this is an hour and 43 minutes before I get to editing it. It's probably going to get down a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and get into our key takeaways for this. Then I have three big ones. I have a meme here, which is a skeleton with two guns shooting into the air, an explosion behind it, and a fiery autism above it. Just because as you can probably see, I like the more absurd memes that it might not really have anything to do with autism, but it's funny to me. That said, first key takeaway, we're always learning new things and developing new knowledge about autism and all disabilities overall, but in particular autism. When I started this work back in 2019, a lot of things that I was thinking then have changed. Not the core things like don't do enablism and maybe listen to us, but the specifics have changed a lot. And that's just from interacting with more people and learning more about others' experiences. There's also no right or wrong way to be autistic. Every autistic person is still autistic. And that includes whether they're diagnosed or undiagnosed. Because as long as there are barriers to getting a diagnosis for a reasonable amount at the very minimum, ideally universal healthcare, that means that there's no barrier in terms of financials or lived experience to getting the diagnostic process done. That's still going to be valid as long as you are informed and actually, not just saying I'm autistic to get internet points, but actually using it as a way to try to find a way to improve your life. Finding support, finding community, finding ways to address things, because once you're an adult, a lot of things are pretty much you are self-addressing. And especially for y'all who aren't autistic out there, I know there's going to be a lot of people who are autistic listening to this one. But if you're not autistic, listen to us about what we need. We are the experts of our own disability because our disability is a million plus others in a trench coat. Our specific presentation of autism is our specific presentation of autism. There's a lot of stuff you can do at a high level, and I'll probably do future episodes on things like common interventions, common supports you can do organizationally, whatever. But listening to us and actually following what we're saying is the number one way that you can support autistic people. Thank you for watching. Looking forward to the next episode. A huge shout out to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are helping to make this project happen. As always, we aren't getting any ad revenue from YouTube, and you'll also get your name up on the screen right about now, like these lovely people who have helped support the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode. Unwelcome Access is a production of Autism, a disability and accessibility consulting organization.